The north is cold and full of whispers.
The river remembers everything it drowns. The ford had been a crossing once, a practical thing, 20 yards of shallowing water where the Red Fork narrowed between two shelves of limestone, where merchants and travelers had been crossing for 200 years without incident. They called it the Ruby Ford because of the red stones in the riverbed that caught the light at certain hours of the afternoon. By the time the two armies met there, the rubies were invisible. The water was too dark. Both banks were crowded with men who had been fighting since dawn. The rebel host, Stark direwolves, Baratheon stags, Arryn falcons, Tully trout, held the western approach. 7 great houses and 100 lesser ones, all of them bound by the same grievance, a mad king who burned men alive and called it justice. The loyalist host held the east, the Targaryen dragon, the Wentbat, the son and spear of Dorne. And they were fresher, better supplied, and had the advantage of the ground. They had been pushing the rebel center back toward the ford for 3 hours. The rebel lines were not broken. Not quite. But they were bending. On the eastern bank, in the thick of it, Rhaegar Targaryen moved like something apart from the men around him. He was 24 years old. His silver-gold hair was matted against his neck with river water and sweat, and his rubied breastplate, the one they would write songs about, had taken a lance strike that left a dent above his left ribs, and his sword arm was bleeding from a cut he hadn't noticed until the blood reached his glove. He didn't notice it now either. He moved through the loyalist press with the controlled economy of a man who had trained for exactly this, and all of it felt wrong. He had not wanted this battle. He had wanted the Great Council, the one his father had refused to call. He had wanted the men dying in this river to be arguing in a hall instead. He fought anyway. Because there was no other way to reach what came next, and what came next was the only thing that mattered. The battle was not going to end with tactics. Both sides knew it. The rebel host had too much will, and the loyalist host had too much strength, and the only way this ended was if one side lost the thing holding them together. For the loyalists, that thing was the crown. For the rebels, it was the man who wore the warhammer. They found each other in the water. Robert Baratheon saw Rhaegar across the ford and started walking. Not riding. Walking, his horse had been killed under him an hour ago and he hadn't found another, and it hadn't slowed him. Robert Baratheon at war was a force that terrain could inconvenience but not stop. And he walked into the current with his warhammer already in his grip, its head black with what the river hadn't yet cleaned off. 20 men today. Maybe more. He had stopped counting. He was enormous. Even waist-deep and slowing in the current, he was enormous, barrel-chested and 21 years old, and absolutely certain that the silver-haired man across the water was the cause of every death that had happened today. Every widow the rebellion would make, every burned lord, everything that had gone wrong since the tourney at Harrenhal, since a crown of blue winter roses, since the world had decided to unmake itself. He screamed something. The river took the words. Rhaegar waded in to meet him. They came together at mid-ford, the water at both their waists, and the speed of what happened next was an insult to its weight. Robert swung first, the warhammer in a rising arc that should have taken Rhaegar in the chest, that had taken chests before, that had caved in plate armor at Stony Sept like it was birch bark. The swing was fast for the water. Not fast enough. Rhaegar twisted, the way a man does when his whole body has understood violence for so long that it moves before the thought finishes forming. The warhammer caught his left shoulder guard instead of his sternum, and the sound it made was a crack that carried across the ford and stopped men on both banks for a single held breath, steel against steel, something giving in Rhaegar's shoulder, his collarbone probably, from the way the pain arrived all at once, and in the same motion, the same breath, his sword found the gap between Robert's gorget and the lower edge of his helm. He didn't push. He didn't need to. Robert's knees went first. The warhammer slipped out of his hands and into the water, and for a moment he was still upright, held there by shock and refusal and the sheer momentum of a man who had never understood that he could lose, and then the moment broke, and he began to fall. Rhaegar caught him. He didn't know why. He would think about it for years and never arrive at a clean answer. But he caught Robert Baratheon under the arms and lowered him instead of letting the current take him, and Robert died in 3 feet of water, with his face turned to the sky and his eyes open. The blood, leaving him and moving with the river around them both, and whatever he saw in those last seconds. Rhaegar was the last thing he looked at. Rhaegar stood in the river with a dead man in his arms. Then, the Loyalist army found its voice. The roar of it crossed the water like something physical, and the rebel center looked at the ford and understood what it meant. And the understanding moved through them the way cold moves through a room when the fire goes out, gradually, and then all at once. Their king was in the river, the warhammer was gone. The man who had made them believe they could win this was dead in 3 feet of water, and the Loyalists were screaming. The western bank began to give. Not a rout, not panic. The retreat was the retreat of men who still had enough discipline to be ashamed of retreating. Companies that had been holding began to inch backward. Flanks that had been advancing stalled and then reversed. The rebel momentum that had carried them from the Stormlands and the North and the Vale simply stopped, like a fire running out of fuel. Rhaegar watched it happen. Then, he raised his sword, blade toward the sky, and held it there. The signal for quarter. For mercy. For stop. Not every Loyalist commander saw it. Not everyone who saw it obeyed immediately. Some of them had been fighting for 8 hours, and the blood was still loud in their ears, and a dead Robert Baratheon felt like license, not like a reason to hold. The battle ground on for another half-hour. Men dying in the reed beds at the river's edge, men dying in the churned mud of the approaches, men dying in the fort itself where the water was dark enough now that you couldn't see the bottom. A half-hour is long enough to hold a city's worth of regret. Rhaegar watched every minute of it. When the fighting finally stilled, the rebel lords on the western bank were encircled. Not prisoners. Not yet. Not formally. Eddard Stark held what remained of his household guard in a loose ring on the bank, and Jon Arryn's banner still flew above it, and these were not men who were going to kneel in the mud and beg. But they were surrounded by the army that had just killed their king, and the ford between them was very quiet now, except for the sound of the water. Rhaegar mounted a horse someone brought him. He found a white cloth. He rode alone to the water's edge. Across the ford he could see Eddard Stark clearly, gray-eyed, mud-caked, the grief on his face still arriving in waves that hadn't finished yet. His sword was still in his hand. The kind of man who would stand in the middle of a lost battle and keep his sword in his hand simply because letting go of it would mean accepting what had just happened, and he was not there yet. Rhaegar dismounted, handed the reins to no one. The horse wandered 3 steps and dropped its head to the bank grass and walked into the ford alone. No guard behind him. No standard bearer. No company of knights to demonstrate his security. Just the prince who had killed their king, walking across the river with his collarbone broken and the rubies quiet beneath his feet. That walk was the gesture. The one that made Eddard Stark's sword hand loosen. Not trust. Not yet. But the willingness to listen to a man who had just proven he would cross unarmed to be heard. They stood 3 yards apart in the middle of the Red Fork, and the water moved around them both, and Rhaegar looked at the man he had made into an enemy and said the only true thing he had. "Your sister is alive, Lord Stark. She is safe. She went with me willingly. If you want to see her again, you will listen to what I have to say." Ned Stark's face, the fury for Robert. The grief still coming, still not finished. The shock of a man who had gone to war for 2 reasons and lost one of them in the ford an hour ago, and the other one was somewhere alive, and this man was the only one who could take him there. He listened. Behind them, in the current below their feet, the rubies caught the afternoon light, red stones in dark water, drifting with the river, settling into the bed one by one, where they would stay for 100 years, marking the place where the world had changed its mind. The tent smelled like river water and leather and the specific kind of silence that only exists between men who have been trying to kill each other's armies all day. Someone had erected it quickly, it showed. One of the canvas walls hadn't been properly staked, and it breathed in and out with the afternoon wind off the Red Fork, a slow, wet exhale, over and over. The floor was half river gravel and half muddy bank, and it crunched under every shift of weight. Someone had brought a camp table and set 2 cups on it that neither man touched. Rhaegar sighed, Barristan Selmy, standing slightly behind and left, his right arm wrapped from elbow to wrist where a rebel blade had found him in the ford. Not deep enough to kill him, deep enough to make the bandaging necessary. He stood anyway. That was Barristan. His sword hand was free. It would always be free. Beside him, Lyanna Martell. Alive in this timeline by a margin of 20 minutes, and a battle that had ended before the worst of it. Dark, broad, wearing the look of a man still doing the arithmetic of his own survival, and not yet liking the total. Ned's side, Jon Arryn, who had aged 10 years in the past 6 hours, and wore it without apology. His white hair was flattened against his skull. His hands, clasped in front of him on the table, were the hands of a man deliberately keeping them still. Behind him, 2 of Ned's household knights whose names the chapter does not require, standing with the rigid blankness of men who understood they were in a room where history was being made and had decided the safest response was to be invisible. Ned himself stood. He had not sat when invited. He would not sit. His sword was at his belt. The decision to sheath it when he crossed the ford had cost him something he didn't have a name for yet. Rhaegar stood across the table from him. The collarbone was broken. You could see it in the angle he held his left shoulder, slightly forward, carefully fixed, the way a man holds a part of himself that has stopped working and must be managed rather than used. He had not asked for a maester. He would not ask until this was done. He did not begin with Lyanna. That was the first thing Ned noticed. Another man, a man who had prepared a speech, a man who was performing rather than speaking, would have led with the thing he knew Ned wanted most, would have offered it like a coin. Rhaegar led with what was true. "The realm believes I abducted her," he said. "I know that. I know what the songs will say. I know what the war was called, what I was called. I am not here to ask you to forgive any of it." Ned said nothing. "Men died," Rhaegar continued. "Good men. Men who had nothing to do with the choices I made. Your father. Your brother. I did not put them in that throne room, but what I did put events in motion that led them there, and I understand that the distance between my intentions and your losses is not a distance you are required to find meaningful." The tent breathed. Ned's jaw was a hard line. "Say what you came to say." "She came with me," Rhaegar said. "I did not take her. I asked her, and she said yes. I know you do not believe that. I know Robert would never have believed that. But she is alive. She is waiting for me at the place where I left her, which is a tower in the Dornish marches, 3 days' ride from where we are standing. She is carrying my child. That is the truth of it, all of it, and I have no interest in telling you a more comfortable version." Jon Arryn's hands shifted, still clasped, but shifted. Ned looked at Rhaegar for a long time, the look of a man running the numbers on something he cannot afford to disbelieve, and equally cannot afford to accept without evidence. He had a face built for exactness, for the correct name of a thing rather than the convenient one, and the correct name of what he felt right now was something he was not going to say in this tent. "And my father," Ned said. "My brother." Here it was, the place where a lesser man would have deflected, would have offered sympathy without weight. "Crimes," Rhaegar said. "Not justice. Not his right. Crimes. Your father asked for trial by combat and was refused. Your brother came to demand his own father's release and was murdered for the asking. I was not in King's Landing. I do not offer that as absolution, only as fact. And my father cannot be permitted to continue." The tent was very quiet. Jon Arryn was the one who spoke next. His voice was the voice of a man who had seen 60 years of politics and had stopped confusing emotion with clarity. "You're asking us to help you take your father's throne." "I am telling you," Rhaegar said, "that it is going to happen. What I am asking is whether you would like to be present when it does, or whether you would prefer to march your remaining forces north and spend the next 2 years wondering what kind of king I became." Arryn looked at Ned. Ned looked at the tent floor, at the river gravel, at the things he was not going to be able to say out loud in front of witnesses. Robert was dead. That fact had not finished arriving yet. It was still moving through him in sections. The knowledge was there, the shape of it was clear, but the weight of it was delivering itself piece by piece, like a man carrying something too heavy by breaking the journey into parts. Robert was dead. Robert, who had laughed too loud at everything and broken 4 chairs at Ned's wedding celebration and cried. Once, briefly at the news from King's Landing about Lyanna's disappearance, turning away quickly so no one would see it. Robert, who was in the ford behind them, and whom Ned would ask about later would have to ask about, the body and the burial and Storm's End and Stannis and all of it. Later. Not now. Not now, because if he stopped to be Ned Stark who had just lost his closest friend, he would not be Ned Stark who was responsible for every man on the Western Bank. Jon Arryn's hand touched his arm. A brief thing. The touch of an old lord who had fostered both of them, and understood what they were to each other, and what the absence of one of them meant to the other. He said it quietly. "We did not go to war to take the throne, Ned. We went to war to get our people back. The king who would give them back to us is standing in front of you." The river outside, the tent breathing. Gravel under Ned's boots. He looked up at Rhaegar. 4 things, Ned said, and you don't negotiate them. Rhaegar waited. Safe passage for every man on that bank, amnesty for every lord who rode under rebel banners. Full amnesty, not conditional, not pending. Done. I ride with you to King's Landing, not as your prisoner, not as your guest, as witness. Every decision you make from now until that throne room is settled, I watch. I would have it no other way. After King's Landing is secured, you take me to her yourself. Not a maester. Not a Kingsguard. You. Rhaegar said nothing for a moment. Then, yes. Ned held the last one for a beat. The heaviest one. The one that wasn't a demand so much as a warning. If this is a different kind of trap, if what's waiting at the end of this is another version of the same lie, I will not go to the wall for what I do next. Are we clear? It wasn't a question. We are clear, Rhaegar said. They did not shake hands. There was no contract signed, no raven sent, no formal language invoked. In the years that followed, men would call it the Silver Wolf Pact and argue about its terms and its implications, and what exactly had been promised in a river tent on a gravel bank at the Ruby Ford. None of them had been in the tent. None of them knew that the only binding instrument in the room had been 2 men looking at each other, with no room left for comfortable dishonesty. Ned turned toward the tent opening, then stopped. The question sat in him like riverstone. About the ford, about what was still in the water, or had been moved by now, or needed to be moved. About Storm's End, and a man who had not deserved to die in a river crossing, who had deserved something louder and more suitable. Who had at minimum deserved a better ending than 3 feet of water and someone else's arms. He didn't ask. He couldn't ask. Not yet. The weight of it was still arriving in sections, and he needed all of them to arrive before he could hold the whole thing properly, and this was not the time. This was not the place, and asking would have meant letting Rhaegar see it. He walked out of the tent. The afternoon light had shifted westward. Lower, longer, turning the river the color of old bronze. Rhaegar came out 2 steps behind him, and they stood on the bank and looked at the ford and the armies beyond it, and the men on both sides looked back and saw no fighting. That was enough. It would have to be. Rhaegar's shoulder was held at that careful, wrong angle. His silver hair was drying in the low light, the blood almost gone, just river water now. Ned was caked with Trident mud from the thigh down, and it was beginning to dry and crack at the edges. Neither man said anything further. Below them, in the current in the gravel bed where merchants had been crossing for 200 years without incident, the rubies caught the last of the afternoon sun. Brief red flickers in the dark water, going still, going dark, settling into the places where they would remain. The first raven left before the bodies were cold. Rhaegar wrote it himself, which was not customary, princes dictated. Maesters wrote, but he did not want a maester's hand between his mind and the words. He sat in the command tent with a candle that smoked in the river damp and wrote 4 sentences. Victory is secured. Robert Baratheon is dead. Your prince returns. Prepare the city to receive him. He tied it himself. He watched it go. A black shape against the last light climbing east, carrying the kindest possible version of what had just happened. and he had perhaps 12 hours before the truth became more complicated than that. He wrote the second one an hour later. This one took longer, not because the words were difficult, but because the lie in them had to be the right kind of lie, the kind that was technically true from a certain angle if you didn't look at it directly. The rebel lords have submitted. I am returning to King's Landing with them under my escort. Submitted was doing significant work in that sentence. So was escort. He sent it. The third raven he held in his hands for a moment before he wrote anything. The bird was irritated about being held and expressed this opinion directly and without diplomacy. Rhaegar looked at it. Thought about Jaime Lannister in the throne room at King's Landing, young, barely past his first years as a knight, Aerys's golden Kingsguard, the boy who had been his squire before the king took him, standing guard over a man who was becoming something that couldn't be managed from a distance much longer. He wrote in the cipher they had used when Rhaegar was still riding tourneys and Jaime had been running his correspondence. It was a simple system, years old, probably breakable by anyone patient enough to try. But Aerys would not try. Aerys read nothing anymore that Rosart did not bring him. Do not let the treasurer's candles be lit. I am coming. Hold everything until I arrive. On your honor as a knight, and whatever remains of our friendship. He tied it. He watched it go. Then he went to find Ned Stark and explain what happened next. The division of forces took most of the night. Jon Arryn would take the main body, rebel and loyalist combined, an army that would have seemed like a fever dream 6 hours ago, and now had to be managed as a logistical reality. 20,000 men, mixed banners, officers who had been attempting to kill each other's soldiers until mid-afternoon, all of them marching for King's Landing at the pace of the slowest wagon. That pace would get them to the city in 3 weeks, if the roads were good. The roads were not going to be good. Call it 25 days. Rhaegar would take 800 cavalry. 400 loyalist horse, 400 rebel riders who had volunteered under the terms of the agreement reached in the tent, which was a generous way of saying they had been carefully selected from units whose commanders Ned Stark trusted not to start something on the road. Light, fast, carrying 5 days of supplies and planning to live off the land and the hospitality of Crownland's lords for the rest. 800 men could reach King's Landing in 9 days if they pushed. They needed to push. Ned had his own horse back, a northern gray that had survived the battle by the simple luck of being tied at the rear, and it stood now, with its head down in the early morning dark, while its rider looked at the order of march and said nothing for long enough that saying nothing became its own kind of speech. 9 days, he finally said, roughly. And the raven arrives tomorrow morning. It may already have arrived. Ned looked at Rhaegar over the gray's neck. So your father has tomorrow morning until we arrive to decide what to do with the information that you've won a battle and you're riding home with the rebel army at your back. That is the situation, yes. Then why are we standing here? They rode before dawn. The king's road through the Crown Lands was not the road it became later, under better maintenance. In the middle of the night in the wet of a recent summer, it was a thing of mud and intention, the intention being that it would eventually lead somewhere, and the mud being what it actually delivered. The cavalry made reasonable time in the dark and better time at dawn, and by the second day had settled into the rhythm of a march that knew what it was, not a parade, not a campaign. Just 800 people moving as fast as 800 people could move, without killing horses they needed. On the second night, Rhaegar sent scouts ahead with letters for the Crownland's lords, whose keeps sat along the road. The letters asked for fresh horses at relay points, not requested, not purchased, required, in the language of a man who was not yet styling himself king, but was issuing orders with the same confidence. Most of the lords complied. One didn't. Rhaegar did not stop to address this. He noted the name and kept moving. The Tywin news arrived on the third day, via a rider from the rear. A loyalist scout who had been watching the western approaches and had seen what there was to see. 12,000 Lannister soldiers moving east from Casterly Rock. Crimson and gold, the full host, Tywin's personal banner at the head of the column. Moving at campaign pace, not at all as if they were surprised by events, not at all as if they were scrambling to respond, as if they had been waiting. Rhaegar received this information on horseback without stopping. He passed it to Ned, who was riding to his left, with the same tone you'd use to describe the weather. "He's been ready since the war began," Ned said. "Since before the war began. How fast can he reach King's Landing?" "Faster than the main body. Slower than us. So he arrives after us. If we don't slow down." They didn't slow down. The campfire on the fourth night was Ned's idea. Not for warmth. He'd lived through enough northern winters that the summer chill off the Red Fork registered as approximately nothing, but because the men needed to see their commanders be still for an hour. An army that watches its leaders run develops a specific kind of anxiety that spreads downward through the ranks, and costs you more on day 7 than the hour of stillness would have cost you on day 4. Rhaegar understood this without being told. He sat. He let the fire exist. They were alone at the perimeter of the camp by unspoken agreement. Close enough that the nearest guards were visible, but far enough that the conversation between them had some chance of remaining between them. Ned stared at the fire for a while. Then, "Why Lyanna?" Not accusation, not the opening move of an argument, just a question that had been waiting 9 months to be asked by the person who had the right to ask it. Rhaegar was quiet for long enough that the fire said something first, a crack and shift of wood. "Have you ever read about the Long Night?" Ned looked at him. 8,000 years ago, a winter that lasted a generation. The dead walking, creatures from beyond the wall driving everything living before them until there was almost nothing left to drive. Old Nan's stories. Old Nan's stories have a habit of being older than the people who tell them. Rhaegar turned a stick in the fire, not looking at Ned. "My father believed in a prophecy. He believed it literally, which is the only way my father was capable of believing anything toward the end, and his solution was to position himself as the fulfillment of it through fire, because his mind had made fire into the answer for everything." What prophecy? The prince that was promised. Azor Ahai reborn, a hero wielding a weapon of living flame against the darkness that is coming again. He paused. "I believe in the prophecy. I do not believe my father's interpretation of it. I believe the hero is not a single person. I believe it requires, the word is specific, in the original text, 3 heads, 3 riders, ice and fire together." Ned was very still. "Your sister has the North in her blood going back 8,000 years to the age when your ancestors were kings and the wall was new. I have the dragon. I believed, I still believe, that the child between us carries something neither of us carries alone. Something the realm is going to need." The fire. The dark outside it. "You caused a war," Ned said. "You killed Robert. You burned 2 kingdoms and orphaned 1,000 children. For a prophecy. Yes. And if you're wrong?" Rhaegar looked at him then. Directly, without the diplomatic insulation that princes used as a matter of professional habit. "Then I am the worst man who ever lived, and history will be right to remember me that way, and none of the rest of it matters." Ned held that, turned it, set it down somewhere he would return to. "What is coming?" he said finally. "Specifically, what are we preparing for?" "The dead," Rhaegar said, "not as a story, not as 8,000-year-old history, as a thing that is going to happen in our lifetimes if we do not build something capable of stopping it." A northern lord's silence. The particular quality of a man who grew up hearing the wind off the wall in every story anyone ever told him about what the dark could hold, reassessing what he thought he had decided about those stories. "Then we need to survive King's Landing first," Ned said. "Yes." "And Tywin." "Yes." "And your father." "Yes." "Then ride faster." He stood, brushed mud from his breeches, and walked back toward the camp. Rhaegar sat alone at the fire for another moment. Somewhere east of them, King's Landing was receiving ravens. Somewhere west, 12,000 Lannister soldiers were eating up the road in the dark. Somewhere south, in a tower in the Red Mountains. A woman was waiting with a child that the world did not yet know how to hold. He was 9 days away from all of it. He kicked dirt on the fire and stood. Tywin Lannister had been waiting outside King's Landing for 2 days. He was not a man who waited comfortably. Patience for him was not a virtue so much as a discipline. Something exercised the way a soldier exercises a muscle that is not his dominant one, deliberately and with full awareness of the effort involved. He sat in his camp chair outside the Lannister command tent, and he read his correspondence, and he gave his orders, and he waited. And the men around him were very careful not to mistake the stillness for peace. 12,000 soldiers in crimson and gold filled the King's Road approach from the tree line to the city walls, cavalry in the van, infantry filling the approaches to the secondary gates, siege equipment that had not been assembled because no one had given the order to assemble it yet. That yet had its own weight. The men understood it. They had marched from Casterly Rock at campaign pace, on orders from a lord, who had told them only that they were needed in the east, and they had arrived to find the gates of the capital city closed against them and a garrison watching from the walls with the specific expression of men who have been told to let no one in and are not sure what to do. About the fact that the someone currently outside has 12,000 people with him. Aerys had not opened the gate. The Raven had arrived, Rhaegar's first one, the clean version, the one announcing victory and return. Aerys had reportedly received it in the throne room with something resembling relief. Then the second Raven had arrived, and his informants had begun adding detail to the story. And the relief had curdled in the specific way that Aerys's emotions had been curdling for years now, turning inward and hot and strange. A son who rode home was a son. A son who rode home with the rebel lords traveling freely alongside him, unbound, under no apparent guard, laughing at campfires. That was something else. Aerys understood what it was, in the place in his mind that was still capable of understanding things. He had understood it the moment the second Raven arrived. He had not opened the gate for Tywin either. So, Tywin waited. And in waiting, had made himself the most powerful military presence within a day's ride of the capital, which was either a coincidence or it was Tywin Lannister. And Tywin Lannister did not deal in coincidences. Inside King's Landing, Jaime had been awake for 43 hours. The coated raven had arrived on the second day of the siege that wasn't a siege yet, and he had read it 3 times in the maester's alcove off the throne room corridor with his body angled, so that if anyone walked past, they would see only a Kingsguard reading correspondence. Not a Kingsguard working out the implications of what he had just been asked to hold together. The treasurer's candles. Do not let them be lit. He knew what it meant. He had known since the night Aerys had first shown him the caches, shown him in the way a man shows you something that is also a test, watching your face for the reaction that would tell him whether you were loyal or simply afraid. Jaime had given him loyal. It had cost him something he couldn't price. He had been managing Rosart for 2 days by the time the Raven arrived, and managing Rosart meant being present everywhere Rosart was, which Rosart had initially interpreted as Kingsguard diligence and was now beginning to interpret as something else. The pyromancer was a small man with a wide forehead and the slightly glazed quality of someone who had spent too many years in the company of things that burned. He watched Jaime watching him and said nothing, because he was shrewd enough to know that accusing a Kingsguard of surveillance without evidence was an accelerated route to personal catastrophe. Twice in 2 days, Aerys had given the order. The first time, Jaime had interrupted with news of Tywin's arrival, genuine news, actually true, delivered with a Kingsguard's appropriate urgency, and Aerys had become distracted by what Tywin's arrival meant and whether Tywin was friend or enemy this time, which was a question that had been occupying Aerys in rotating configurations for a decade. And by the time the distraction cleared, the moment for the order had passed. The second time had been harder. Aerys had screamed it at Rosart in the throne room at 2 a.m, with 3 pyromancer apprentices present, and Jaime had stepped between Rosart and the door and said, very quietly, that there was a technical problem with the eastern caches, and Rosart's personal attention was required before any ignition sequence could begin. Rosart had stared at him. Jaime had held the stare with the particular blankness of a man who had long since made his peace with what he was willing to do and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Rosart had gone to inspect the eastern caches. The caches were fine. Rosart would be back within the hour. Jaime had not slept, could not sleep, and had spent the intervening time doing the mathematics of how many more hours he needed to produce from somewhere before a silver-haired prince arrived to take the problem out of his hands. Rhaegar's vanguard came over the King's Road rise at mid-morning. The Lannister pickets saw them first, and the information traveled backward through the camp quickly, and efficiently the way information travels in a well-run military operation, arriving at Tywin's camp chair with the accuracy and approximate emotional temperature of a stone dropped in still water. 800 cavalry, mixed banners, Targaryen dragon, Stark direwolf, Baratheon stag, others, coming at the pace of men who had been riding hard and had not stopped being in a hurry. At the head of the column, silver-gold hair unmistakable at 300 yards, riding with his left shoulder at that careful wrong angle that meant something had happened to it, and he had decided the something could wait. Tywin stood. The two forces faced each other across 400 yards of King's Road, 12,000 Lannister soldiers on one side, 800 mixed cavalry on the other. The gates of King's Landing at the far end, still closed, the garrison still watching from the walls with that same expression. It was Ned Stark who moved first. He rode out from the vanguard column alone, no banner, no guard, a northern lord on a gray horse, who looked like he had been sleeping in river mud for a week, because he had. He stopped at the edge of the Lannister picket line and looked at the outriders with the specific expression of a man who has recently survived a battle and a negotiation in the same afternoon and has consequently run out of patience for preliminary theater. "Tell your lord that Prince Rhaegar is here," he said. "Tell him that if he wants to have a conversation with a future king, now is the time. If he doesn't, he should find somewhere else to camp." The outriders looked at each other. The message went back. Tywin received it, and the receiving of it was a small event, a slight adjustment of the shoulders, a folding of the correspondence he had been reading, a stillness that was different from the stillness he had been maintaining for 2 days in the quality of its attention. He emerged from the camp on horseback. Alone. This was not humility. Tywin did not own humility and had never rented it. This was the calculation of a man who understood that the power of a gesture came from its precision. 12,000 men behind him made the gesture. Accompanying them would only dilute it. He was 54 years old, and looked it and did not look diminished by it. The gold and crimson he wore were travel-worn, but correct. His beard was close trimmed. His eyes, which were green and cold and had not changed in the 30 years of his public career that anyone could remember, moved from Rhaegar to Ned to the mixed banners behind them and conducted a rapid private inventory of what they meant. He stopped his horse 10 yards from Rhaegar. Neither man spoke first. This was not a standoff. It was two people declining to be the one who introduced the subject of what they both wanted. Then Tywin said, "You look like you've been in a river." "I have been in a river." "Robert Baratheon." "Yes. Your collarbone." "Cracked, not broken through." Tywin absorbed this, and the rebel lords. "Behind me. Jon Arryn commands the main body. They are 3 weeks out at minimum. Yet Lord Stark rides with your vanguard. Lord Stark is a practical man." Tywin looked at Ned with the expression of someone filing information for later use. Ned returned the look with a flatness that communicated, accurately, that he was aware of being filed. "The city is closed," Tywin said. "I know. My host has been outside these walls for 2 days. I know that as well. You will stand down, Lord Tywin. You will not enter this city before I do, and you will not enter it at all until I have spoken with my father." Tywin's expression did not change. This was one of his more unnerving qualities. The absence of visible reaction was not absence of reaction. "I have 12,000 soldiers, and I have the throne," Rhaegar said. "Not the chair. The throne. The right to it, the blood, and the army behind me that represents every major house in this realm agreeing, some more voluntarily than others, that I am the legitimate continuation of Targaryen rule. Your 12,000 soldiers are an asset. An asset requires a purpose. What purpose would you like them to serve?" Here it was. The question that had been sitting under every word since Tywin rode out of his camp. He answered it the way he answered everything, directly, without dressing it. "I want the handship restored. My tenure ended under circumstances that were unjust and politically motivated, and the record should reflect that I served the realm ably for 16 years. I want that acknowledged." "Acknowledged and restored," Rhaegar said. "You will be Hand of the King, once the city is secured and the situation with my father resolved." "Jaime. What about Jaime?" His situation is known to you. His situation is that he is a Kingsguard who serves with honor. His situation beyond that is a conversation for another time, in a different context. When there are fewer urgent matters competing for my attention. Tywin heard what was in that. The deliberate space left open. The thing not refused. He had been building and managing rooms with deliberate spaces in them for 30 years, and he recognized the architecture. And the position of House Lannister under your reign. Proportionate to its contributions, Rhaegar said, which, as of this morning, include standing down peacefully from the gates of my capital city at my request. That is a contribution I will remember. It was a gracious threat. Tywin recognized it as such. The green eyes moved once more over the vanguard behind Rhaegar, over Ned Stark, over the gates of King's Landing still closed behind 12,000 soldiers who were about to be asked to simply stop being there. He had not lived this long by confusing the moment to push with the moment to accept. Then we are in agreement, Tywin said. We are in agreement. Neither man extended a hand. The agreement between them existed entirely in the air where it had been spoken, in words that both of them understood were worth precisely as much as the next 10 years of behavior would make them worth, and not a syllable more. Tywin turned his horse and rode back to his camp to give the order to stand down. Rhaegar watched him go. He'll hold it, Ned said, riding up. For now. For now is all I need. Behind the walls, somewhere in the Red Keep, Jaime Lannister was buying hours with the currency of lies and positioning, and the city was intact, and Tywin's crimson banners were beginning, slowly, to move back from the gates. The gates of King's Landing remained closed. Rhaegar rode forward to speak to the garrison commander. They rode south with a small party because the south required it. 8 men total, Rhaegar, Ned, Barristan Selmy, whose arm had been properly set and splinted in King's Landing, and who had argued for the ride anyway and won the argument, and 5 guards who had been selected for their ability to keep their mouths closed about where they were going and why. The main business of the capital was left behind with Tywin, whose first act as reinstated hand had been to begin organizing the city's administration with an efficiency that was either impressive or alarming depending on where you sat. Rhaegar had noted both possibilities and left anyway. Some things could not be delegated. The Dornish marches in high summer were red rock and dry heat, and a sky so clear and blue it looked like something painted. Different from the Crownlands, different from anywhere that had felt like war recently. The road south from King's Landing into the marches narrowed as it entered the hills, and the hills reddened as they went deeper, the limestone giving way to the older stone underneath. Orange and rust and deep brown, the colors of something cooked by a sun that had been at it for longer than men had been counting. 3 days. Rhaegar had promised Ned 3 days. On the 3rd afternoon, with the red mountains visible on the horizon and the air smelling of dust and the specific dry sweetness of Dornish wildflowers growing in the rock cracks, Ned asked the question he had been not asking since the campfire 4 nights ago. The prophecy, he said. All of it. What you haven't told me. They were riding at the rear of the small column. The guards were far enough ahead that conversation required no lowering of voices. Rhaegar did not deflect. He had told Ned on the road from the Trident that he would get the full account when there was time for it, and 3 days of riding had given him time to decide how to give it without it sounding like a man defending choices that had cost thousands of lives with mysticism. He told him about Aegon the Conqueror first, about the dragon dreams, the visions that Aegon's descendants received in sleep, the prophetic images that recurred across generations in Targaryen history with the specific persistence of things that meant something, rather than things that merely happened. He told him about Jenny of Oldstones and the Woods Witch's prophecy, that the prince that was promised would be born of the line of the Prince of Dragonstone, about how that prophecy had filtered down through generations and arrived at Rhaegar's grandfather, who had arranged the marriage that produced Aerys, who had produced Rhaegar. He told him about the comet readings, about the Jade Compendium, about the night he had spent in the Dragonstone Library at 16 years old and come out a different person because of a passage about Azor Ahai and the Last Hero and what they had in common, which was more than anyone had previously noticed. You changed, Ned said. After that night, became a warrior instead of a scholar. I understood what the scholar was for, what he had to build before the warrior could matter. And the 3 heads. The dragon has 3 heads. It is in the oldest texts. 3 riders, not 1 hero with a sword. The hero is a unity of 3, and the unity requires both ice and fire, not one or the other. Ned was quiet for a moment. Then, so my sister's children were always in this, even before she knew. The prophecy does not require consent, Rhaegar said. That is the thing I have never found a way to forgive it for. The tower appeared at dusk. It was not grand. That was the first thing you expected, from the name, from the songs that would eventually accumulate around it, something imposing. What it was a squat fortification of old red stone, 3 stories. 1 narrow window on each face, positioned on a flat shelf of rock above a dry wash that would fill with water for approximately 6 weeks a year and was bone dry now. It had probably been a watchtower once, for some lord whose name no one had needed to know for several generations. 3 men stood before the entrance, white cloaks in the dusk, which caught the last of the light in a way that was almost decorative. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Gerald Hightower, stood at the center, silver-haired, straight-backed, the absolute physical posture of a man who has not once in his life questioned whether the thing he was doing was the right thing to do. Oswell went to his left, a went bat on his collar visible from 50 yards, and on the right, holding a sword that was not like other swords, pale, almost white, a blade that seemed to hold the failing light rather than reflect it, Arthur Dayne. The sword of the morning. He was 30 years old and looked like the songs described him, which was not something that could be said for most men who inspired songs. Lean, with the kind of physical economy that meant nothing about him was decorative, every part of him was in service of the whole, and the whole was in service of the sword he carried. His face was without warmth or coldness both, a Dornishman's dark complexion, burnished deeper still by months in the southern sun. He looked at Rhaegar, and then at Ned, and then at the space between them, and arrived at some private calculation. Ned's hand went to his sword. It was not a choice. It was the body remembering what the mind had been trying not to think about since the parley tent at the Ruby Ford, that Lyanna was here, inside this tower. And between him and the inside of this tower stood the 3 best remaining knights in the 7 kingdoms, and the last time Ned had been in a position anything like this there had been more of him, and worse odds, and Howland Reed had done something that Ned had never spoken of publicly, because the publicly speakable version of it was not the true version, and the true version was something he carried alone. Rhaegar rode forward. Lord Commander. His voice was level. I am here. You are relieved. Hightower's face. The specific expression of a man receiving an order that conflicts directly with a prior order from the same authority. His jaw worked once, closed. He was not a man who showed distress easily. 60 years of Kingsguard discipline did not produce easily distressed men. But the distress was there, in the working jaw and the precise stillness of everything else. Oswell Went's hand was on his sword. The 3 seconds that followed were the longest 3 seconds in the chapter. Then Arthur Dayne said, Your Grace. Not my prince, not my lord. Your Grace, the honorific of a king, spoken by the finest knight living in front of 2 witnesses who would remember it. He said it without drama, without ceremony, in the voice of a man stating what was true. He stepped to the side. Hightower looked at him. Something passed between them, the look of 2 men who had served together for years, who had held this post together for months, who had understood their orders the same way, and were only now discovering that the understanding had a limit. Hightower stepped aside. Went, a beat behind, did the same. Ned's hand came off his sword. He was not aware of it happening. He was watching Arthur Dayne standing in the dust of the Dornish marches, with dawn in his hand and his white cloak catching the last light. Watching the man who should have killed him on the worst day of Ned's life simply step back from a door he had spent months guarding. And the feeling in Ned's chest was not relief so much as it was the precise sensation of a version of events that had been prepared to happen simply not happening, like a cup that tips at the edge of the table and then somehow doesn't fall. He would think about that moment for years, what it cost Arthur Dayne to do it, whether it had cost him anything at all, or whether the choice had been simple from the inside. His king had arrived and issued the counter-command, and the Kingsguard served the king. Ned could never decide which version made him feel worse. The chamber smelled of blood and roses, blue ones, winter roses, which had no business growing anywhere near the Dornish marches, which someone had found or sent for or managed somehow. They sat in a clay cup on the floor beside the bed, already dropping petals, the stems cut too short, a gesture made with what was available. They were Lyanna's. That was obvious without being told. They were the most Lyanna thing in the room, and possibly the most Lyanna thing Ned had ever seen. The stubbornness of insisting on blue roses in a red rock tower in the wrong part of the world. She was in the bed, smaller than he expected, which was always the thing about people you loved. In their absence they grew, and in their presence they returned to their actual size, which was never as large as the space they occupied in your understanding of the world. Her dark hair was loose on the pillow. Her face was pale in the way of someone who had spent significant resources recently and had not yet recovered them. She looked at Ned first. He crossed the room and did not do anything dignified about it. He sat on the edge of the bed and she took his hand in both of hers, which were cold, and they stayed like that for a moment that had no language in it. Then she looked at Rhaegar. What passed between them was too private for the audience to stay in. We see it from Ned's perspective, watching two people who chose each other and are paying the price, and might not survive the payment. The baby was in her arms. Dark hair. Eyes that had not yet decided what color they were going to be, as all newborn eyes were undecided. But something in the face. The set of it. The quiet of it, that would be remarkable later and was already visible now if you knew where to look. Aemon, Lyanna said. She said it to Rhaegar, not as a suggestion, as the name. The thing already decided. Rhaegar looked at his son. Aemon, he repeated. For the man who taught me what it meant to be Targaryen without a throne. Lyanna looked at Ned. It's a better name than what they'd have given him in King's Landing. Anything is a better name than what they'd have given him in King's Landing, Ned said. She almost smiled. Almost, outside, in the dusk, with the red mountains going dark against a sky the color of a bruise at the edges, Rhaegar stood before the three Kingsguard and Ned and Barristan, and he spoke the formal words. Prince Aemon Targaryen. His son. Legitimate, third in the order of succession, after Aegon and Rhaenys. A maester who had come south with the party recorded it on parchment, with 3 witnesses signing. Ned signed. He signed because Lyanna had asked him to, had asked him with her eyes, which had been asking him things across rooms since she was 4 years old and he was 6, and she had wanted him to lie to their father about where she'd been, and he had always been unable to refuse her. He signed, and the parchment was folded, and the dusk completed itself, and the first stars came out over the Dornish marches. He had come to war to retrieve his sister from a tower. She was in the tower. She was alive. The child in her arms was alive. She had gone willingly, and she had paid for it, and the man who had asked her to pay for it was standing 6 feet away looking at his son with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded that Ned had seen on him in 2 weeks. It was not enough. It was not sufficient for what had been spent. Rhaegar knew that, and Ned knew Rhaegar knew it, and neither of them said it, because saying it would not change the mathematics, and they were both men who understood that unchanged mathematics did not improve by being spoken. The bitter note, the one that lived inside the victory. It was enough to be alive. It was enough that Lyanna was alive, the child was alive, the city was not burned. It was enough. Ned looked at the stars coming out and decided it was enough. He did not entirely believe himself. The dragon pit had not been used for anything in 40 years. It showed. The great dome that had once covered it was open sky now. The roof had collapsed in the Dance of Dragons a century and a half ago. When dragon had fought dragon above the city, and the structural consequences had descended on the building below them. What remained was the walls, which were enormous, and the floor, which was cracked and overgrown at the edges where grass had been finding its way through stone for a generation, and the stone benches arranged in concentric rings around the central floor, which were solid and cold, and capable of seating several hundred, if those several hundred did not mind the open sky above them. Rhaegar had chosen it deliberately. His advisors had suggested the throne room. Tywin had suggested the Great Hall. Ned Stark had said nothing, which meant he had an opinion he did not think would be received well, and Rhaegar had read this correctly and asked him directly, and Ned had said, "Not the throne room. The throne room is yours. A council of lords isn't. The dragon pit it was. The place where the Targaryens had chained their dragons to placate a fearful city. The place where the dynasty's power had been deliberately diminished as a political gesture." Rhaegar understood the symbol he was choosing. He chose it anyway. They came from every direction. Mace Tyrell arrived first, 3 days before the council date, with a retinue of 50 and the bearing of a man who expected a parade and was managing his disappointment at the absence of one. He was broad, florid, pleasant in the way of men who had never needed to be unpleasant because their army was always large enough to make the point for them. He embraced Rhaegar with the enthusiasm of a confirmed loyalist collecting a debt. Doran Martell arrived the morning of the council, with 10 guards and his brother. Doran was carried in a chair, his gout had worsened, and he moved through the world now with the specific economy of a man for whom physical effort was rationed. His face revealed nothing. Oberyn walked beside him with the loose-limbed alertness of a man who was technically present at a political event and was actually doing something else entirely with his attention. Jon Arryn came with the main body, 3 weeks behind the vanguard, looking like a man who had spent 3 weeks managing 20,000 soldiers of mixed loyalty on a single road and was quietly furious about the experience. Hoster Tully arrived from Riverrun with his arm in a sling from a wound that had not fully closed. He was the only man in the dragon pit who looked at Rhaegar with unmediated hostility, not the managed hostility of Ned's careful neutrality or the calculated hostility of Tywin's political positioning, but the raw hostility of a man who had sent sons to fight in a war and was sitting across a floor from the reason they had needed to go. Tywin arrived precisely on time, not early, which would have suggested eagerness, not late, which would have suggested disrespect, precisely on time, which suggested Tywin, which was its own category. Stannis sent a steward. The steward looked miserable about being there and delivered his lord's regrets with the expression of someone who had been given a task they had not wanted, and had decided the most honest approach was to make clear they had not wanted it. Rhaegar acknowledged the absence without comment. Aerys was brought in before the assembled lords. Rhaegar had debated this. Tywin had argued against it. The king's condition is known. Displaying it publicly serves no purpose beyond theater, and for once Tywin's counsel was not entirely self-serving. But the lords needed to see it. They needed to see the thing they had been at war about, or in some cases at careful neutrality about, and they needed to understand that the trial was not a political procedure dressing up a predetermined conclusion. It was a predetermined conclusion that was also true. He came in between 2 guards, which was not technically necessary and was done for the optics of it. Aerys was not physically threatening, had not been physically threatening for years, and the guards were there to communicate dignity rather than security. He wore clean robes. Someone had trimmed his hair and his terrible nails, recently and with evident difficulty. He looked like a man who had been interrupted mid-transformation into something else, and was now caught between what he had been and what the last decade had made him. He did not look at the assembled lords. He looked at a point somewhere above the dragon pit's broken roofline and stayed there, which was either dissociation or the most private form of dignity remaining to him, and it was impossible to know which from the outside. Jon Arryn stated the charges. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 60 years in governance and understood that legal language existed specifically for situations where emotional language would collapse the proceeding. He was precise, and he was merciless, and he did not look at Aerys while he spoke. The murder of Rickard Stark by burning, the murder of Brandon Stark by strangulation, the conspiracy against the lives of Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark, the wildfire conspiracy against the citizens of King's Landing, 2 decades of crimes against prisoners, petitioners, and servants of the crown whose names were listed by a maester reading from a document that had taken 3 weeks to compile. Aerys listened to his name being attached to each of these things with the expression of a man hearing a description of someone he was not sure he remembered. Doran Martell, beside Jon Arryn, said nothing throughout the recitation. He watched Aerys with the eyes of a man who had sent his uncle to die for this king, and his sister to marry this king's son, and was now sitting in a ruined amphitheater watching the final accounting, and whatever he felt about it was his alone. When it was done, Rhaegar asked the question that the procedure required: "How does the realm find?" Jon Arryn said, "Guilty." Doran said, "Guilty." Tywin said nothing for a moment. Then, "Guilty." The word in his mouth was the flattest it had been. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the word, placed where it belonged. Hoster Tully said, "Guilty," and then said nothing else, which took visible effort. The other lords affirmed it in turn. It moved around the stone benches like something being passed hand to hand, each man adding his voice to the weight of it until the weight was sufficient. "He should die," Hoster Tully said when Rhaegar announced the sentence. He said it without particular rancor, a man stating a mathematical position. "He should," Rhaegar agreed. "He won't." "The mercy is yours to give, the cost of it is ours to pay. The cost of killing him is also yours to pay, Lord Tully, and everyone in this building would be paying it for 30 years. A king who executes his own father needs a reason the realm finds sufficient. The realm will not find it sufficient regardless of what it actually is, because the thing being executed is the principle of royal continuity. And that principle protects everyone in this room, whether or not any of us deserves it." Hoster's jaw was tight. But he sat back. Dragonstone, the island fortress at the mouth of Blackwater Bay, the ancestral Targaryen seat before the conquest, the place where Rhaegar himself had been born. Aerys would live there under care and house arrest, tended by maesters, without contact with the court or the capital. His title stripped. Not imprisoned, the distinction mattered, and Rhaegar knew it mattered, and knew that knowing it mattered was not the same as the dead being any less dead. It was not justice, it was the least bad version of the available options, which was what governance usually was. And Rhaegar had made his peace with that on the road from the Trident. The rest of it went quickly, the way things go quickly when the weight has already been carried by what came before. Jon Arryn, Warden of the East, his existing role confirmed and expanded, the Vale's autonomy protected. He accepted it with the nod of a man who had not done any of this for titles, and was accepting the title anyway, because refusing it would require an explanation he did not have time to give. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, all rights and lands confirmed in full. He looked at Rhaegar when it was read, and looked away, which was its own kind of receipt. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, recognized formally in his absence the Tyrell siege lifted by royal command. The steward noted it with the expression of a man who was going to have an extremely uncomfortable conversation with his lord when he got home. Mace Tyrell, commander of the Reach forces, his loyalty recognized. His siege of Storm's End praised in language that implied it had been strategically significant rather than merely prolonged. Mace received this with visible pleasure. Tywin, Hand of the King. The announcement landed in the room differently than the others. The former rebel lords received it with the specific stillness of men who had been expecting it and had decided to be gracious about expecting it. Ned received it with the stillness of a man who had a great deal to say and was choosing the location of that conversation carefully. Rhaegar looked at the room, at the lords of 7 kingdoms sitting in a ruined amphitheater where dragons had been chained in a different century, at the open sky above them, at the cracked floor and the overgrown edges, and the stone that had stood through everything and expected to stand through this too. The crown was silver gold, set with rubies from the Ford. Someone had made it in the 3 weeks since King's Landing, in a hurry, and it showed in the proportions it was slightly too large and had been padded inside with cloth to compensate, and Rhaegar wore it anyway, because there was no better version available, and the moment was happening regardless of the crown's fit. Barristan Selmy placed it. "King Rhaegar," he said. First of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. Lord of the 7 kingdoms, protector of the realm. The assembled lords said the words. Even Hoster Tully. Even Ned Stark, whose voice in the recitation was level and accurate and carried in it absolutely nothing beyond the words themselves, which was a form of honesty Rhaegar recognized and did not mistake for warmth. It was done. King. He was king. He had won the battle he had ridden to lose, survived the city he had expected to find burning, taken the throne by not taking it, and was now wearing a crown that did not fit over a cracked collarbone in a building with no roof. He looked at the open sky above the dragon pit. Blue. In the afternoon, enormous. The place where his ancestors had diminished their own power and called it wisdom. He did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like the beginning of work. The problem had a shape. Rhaegar understood it clearly in the way that you understand something you have always known was coming, not with surprise, but with the specific resignation of a man watching a wave he has been watching build for years finally arrive at the shore. 2 women. 1 title. A kingdom that had 1 word for queen and no procedure for the situation in which that word needed to apply to more than 1 person simultaneously. Elia came to him 3 days after the council. She came in the morning, which was deliberate. Morning was the time of clear heads and direct speech, and Elia Martell had always been a woman who chose her moments the way a general chose to reign. She was 30 years old, and had the particular quality of someone who had survived things through intelligence rather than force, which meant the intelligence was very visible now, in the set of her eyes and the way she held herself, and the complete absence of anything that could be used as a handhold. She sat across from him in his private solar, not the throne room, not a formal audience. A room with a fireplace and 2 chairs and a window overlooking the city, and she looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "I am going to say this once," she said. "I want you to understand that I mean every word of it precisely as it is spoken, and I am not leaving a door open for negotiation on the main point. Elia." "Once," she repeated. "I will accept the situation. I am not a fool, and I have not spent the last year in this city being kept as surety for my husband's loyalty without learning how to assess a situation for what it is rather than what I would prefer it to be. I understand what happened. I understand what she is to you. I even understand the prophecy, which you explained to me 2 years ago, and which I found then as I find now. An insufficient justification for what it cost. The fire between them. The window. The city below going about its mourning. If she is publicly named," Elia continued, "if she stands in any court, in any ceremony, in any document read aloud before witnesses with a title that equals mine or supersedes it, I take my children, and I go home. And with me goes Dorne. Not as a threat, as a consequence. You can choose differently, and the consequence follows. That is the structure of it." Rhaegar said, "I know. I need you to say it back to me. Not no in the way of a man who has understood the words. No in the way of a king who has understood the position. Elia Martell is Queen of Westeros," he said. "There will be no other queen publicly named or recognized. The status of your marriage is not in question and will not be made to seem in question by anything I do publicly. That is my word." She looked at him. The look of a woman measuring the distance between a man's word and his intention and finding it, not large, not reassuring, but sufficient. Barely sufficient. She stood. She smoothed her dress with the precise movement of someone who had been trained since childhood that composed hands were part of composed bearing. "Your son," she said at the door. "Aemon, he has dark hair?" "His mother's hair." "Yes." A pause. Something moved in her face that she did not name, and did not need to name. "Aegon will want a brother eventually," she said. "He is already lonely. That is what your choices have cost him, among other things." She left. Lyanna was in the Tower of the Hand. Rhaegar had placed her there because it was private and well-staffed, and because the alternative was placing her in the royal apartments, which was not possible, and a lesser accommodation, which was not acceptable. The Tower of the Hand was where she lived with Aemon and 3 trusted servants, and the particular fury of a woman who had made a choice at considerable cost and was now being managed rather than acknowledged. She did not sit when Rhaegar came. She stood at the window with her back to him and Aemon in her arms, and did not turn around until she was ready. How long, she said. Not a question. The beginning of an accounting. It's complicated. I grew up in the north, she said. We understand complicated. We also understand when complicated is being used instead of no. There is no version of this in which I can give you the title without destroying the Dornish alliance. You know that. She turned. Her face had none of the softness of the tower in the marches, none of the frailty of recent birth and blood loss. She was 17 years old, and she had the stark look in full, the gray eyes, the dark hair, the quality of someone who had inherited from a long line of people who survived things. She should not have had to be this old this fast, and the knowing of it was in every line of her face. I did not come with you to be someone's secret. I know what I agreed to, and I knew what I was doing, and I would do it again, but I will not be told that the thing I agreed to was this. Being kept in a hand's tower like something that requires management. You are not being managed. You are literally managing me right now. You are standing in this room doing it. He did not argue this. Aemon will be formally listed. Third in succession, in writing, in every document of state. His name will be spoken. His title will be Prince. That is not nothing. No, she said. It isn't nothing, but it isn't enough. I know. Don't, she said. Don't do the thing where you agree with me because you can't give me the thing I'm right about wanting. It's the most infuriating thing about you, and there are several to choose from. The baby between them, awake and quiet the way that particular infant was always quiet, watching with the eyes that were still deciding what color they would be. Lyanna looked down at him, and the anger in her face stayed, but something alongside it softened at the edges. I'll stay, she said. For him. Because this is where he needs to be, and because you are not wrong about the prophecy even though I wish you were. But Rhaegar, do not make me invisible. In whatever way you can manage without burning the alliance down, do not make me invisible. I won't. She looked at him for a long moment with the gray eyes that Ned Stark also had, and that Aemon was in the process of inheriting. Your word means more than it used to, she said. Given what you managed to keep on the road south. Don't waste that. Doran Martell arrived 6 weeks after the council without invitation, and in Dornish silks in a city where everyone else was wearing Crownland's wool, and he arrived at the Red Keep's gates, and said his name to the guards with the tone of a man who expected the name to be sufficient, which it was. He was shown to Rhaegar's solar. He did not sit. He moved instead, a slow circuit of the room, hands clasped, examining the books on the table and the map on the wall and the view from the window, and Rhaegar watched him do it, and waited. You look, Oberyn said, completing his circuit and stopping in the center of the room, like a man who has won everything and is in the process of discovering what winning cost. Sit down, Oberyn, in a moment. His eyes were the eyes of a man conducting multiple simultaneous calculations and not finding any of them entirely satisfying. I want to look at you while I ask the question I came to ask. It is easier to hear the truth in a man's face than in his voice. Then ask, what is my sister worth to you? The fire, the silence that was not peaceful. She is the queen of Westeros, Rhaegar said. Her children are the crown prince and princess of the 7 kingdoms. Her position is not in question. That is the official answer. It is also the true answer. There is a woman in the Tower of the Hand with a silver-haired infant and a stark look about her, Oberyn said. I have not met her. I don't need to meet her. I know what she is. So the question I am actually asking is, when Elia has been told that her position is not in question, what is the content of that promise? What does not in question actually mean in the day-to-day experience of my sister's life in this city? It means she is queen. It means her children are heirs. It means the woman in the tower will never stand in a court with a title, will never be named publicly, will never formally supersede Elia in anything that can be witnessed. And privately. Privately is mine to manage. Yes, Oberyn said, that is what I was afraid of. He looked at Rhaegar with the expression of a man who has heard an answer that is technically sufficient and knows that technically sufficient is not the same as good. I told Doran I would come and look at you and tell him whether the alliance was safe. And? The alliance is safe, Oberyn said. "My sister's happiness is a different question, and I find that I have been given authority to answer one but not the other, which is itself an answer." He stood. "There is one more thing. Say it." "The boy. Aemon. He is in the succession. Third, yes, after 2 Martell children. After 2 of Elia's children. Yes." Oberyn was quiet for a moment. "Doran will want that in writing, not the private document. Public record." "It is in public record." "Good." He moved toward the door. Stopped. "I did not come here to threaten you, Rhaegar. I want to be clear about that. I came because Elia could not send a letter that said what needed to be said in person, and I am the person in this family suited to saying things in person. Everything I have said to you today, I have said to your face as your ally. I know. And if I ever find that the word you gave her was worth less than she believed it was, you won't need to say the rest of it." "No." Oberyn agreed. "I won't." He left. The inner circle assembled 3 days later. Ned had been summoned from his preparations to return north. He had been 4 days from leaving, and he arrived in Rhaegar's solar with the expression of a man who had been 4 days from leaving and had been prevented, which was specific and not pleasant. Elia sat near the fire with her hands in her lap. Barristan stood at the door. Maester Aemon, ancient, papery, traveled from the wall at Rhaegar's urgent request, sat in the chair nearest the fire, because the cold in his bones was constant now, and the fire was the only argument against it. Rhaegar looked at the people in the room. His queen, his oldest northern ally, his most trusted knight, 100-year-old man who was the last Targaryen he had found worth respecting before he became the last Targaryen himself. He told them everything. The long night. The prophecy. The 3 heads. What he had understood at 16 in the Dragonstone Library, and what 15 years of additional reading had confirmed and refined. He did not perform it. He stated it, in order, with the same flatness he used when he was certain of something, and did not need the certainty decorated. When he reached the 3 heads, he named them. Rhaenys, Aegon, Aemon. He watched Elia understand. It was the specific understanding of a woman who had believed she was collateral damage in a private obsession and was now being told she was load-bearing in a larger structure, that her children were not caught in the wake of her husband's choices, but were precisely where the prophecy had always required them to be, that Rhaegar had not chosen Lyanna instead of her. He had chosen both of them because both were required. It did not heal the wound. There was not a version of this information that healed the wound, but it changed the wound's shape, gave it a frame that was not simply one man's selfishness wearing a prophetic mask. Whether that was better or worse she would decide later, in private, where the decision belonged. She said nothing for a long time. Then, ice and fire. Yes. My children are the fire. Rhaenys and Aegon. Yes. And the woman in the tower's child is the ice. The unification of both lines. Yes, that is what I believe Aemon carries that the others don't carry alone. The fire. The old maester's breathing. Ned Stark very still. You could have told me, Elia said quietly. Years ago. Before any of it. Yes. Why didn't you? Rhaegar looked at her. Because telling you would have made you part of something you hadn't agreed to. I didn't want to recruit you. You wanted, she said. Yes. That is the whole of it. She stood. She was small, and she had always been small, and she had always been more than her size, and that had not changed. She looked at her husband the king in his solar with his prophecy and his choices, and his very precisely kept promises, and she said, My children will ride dragons. Not a question. A statement of what she had decided in the last 3 minutes, which was that if the prophecy was real and her children were in it, then her children would be ready for it. That is my intention, Rhaegar said. Then we understand each other. She left. Not because she was finished, because she had said everything that needed saying, and everything else required time she was going to take elsewhere. Ned looked at Rhaegar. A song of ice and fire, Rhaegar said. That is what I have called it. For years, that is what all of this has been. Ned looked at the fire. At the old maester. At the window where the city continued its business below them, 400,000 people going about their lives inside the structure that had been rebuilt and held together in the last 3 months. "Then you'd better hope," Ned said, "that it's a long one. 15 years is long enough to build something, not long enough to forget what the building cost, or to stop checking the structure in the night for the cracks that might have been missed in the original construction. But long enough for a kingdom that had been a collection of grievances arranged around a throne to become, provisionally, haltingly, with significant amounts of Tywin Lannister's administrative efficiency and Ned Stark's stubborn northern reliability, something that functioned. The Greyjoy Rebellion came 8 years in and lasted 4 months. Balon Greyjoy had watched the realm reorganize itself under a new king, and made the calculation that reorganization was weakness, which was the kind of calculation that men made when they confused newness with fragility. Rhaegar and Ned crushed it together, unhurriedly and with a completeness that removed any subsequent appetite for repetition. Theon Greyjoy came to Winterfell as ward after the Ironborn submitted, a boy of 13 years old with his father's proud bearing and his father's complete inability to understand that proud bearing required something underneath it to be worth anything. Ned received him without cruelty and without warmth, and raised him alongside his own children, which was what the agreement required. The Night's Watch received its first serious royal investment in 3 generations. Gold, men, supply contracts with the northern lords, an understanding that the Wall was not a dumping ground for criminals and bastards, but a defensive structure with a genuine function, and that its staffing would reflect that. The watch commanders, accustomed to begging letters that produced nothing, received the first supply train with expressions of men who suspected a mistake had been made, and were waiting to be corrected. No correction came. Tywin served his hand for 11 years, and his service was what his service to Aerys had been, minus the 20 years of deliberate humiliation, efficient, cold, and productive in the way that only a man who understands the mechanical nature of governance can be productive. He died of a fever in the 11th year, and Rhaegar stood at his funeral with the face of a man honoring a debt that had always been complicated, and said the correct words, and meant approximately half of them. Kevan Lannister succeeded him as a transitional appointment that had now lasted 4 years and showed no signs of becoming permanent. Jaime was 32 years old and still in the Kingsguard, and had the specific quality of a man who had made a choice so long ago that questioning it was no longer a useful exercise, and had redirected the energy of that question into becoming the finest active sword in the 7 kingdoms. He trained the royal household knights and sparred with Prince Aegon in the mornings and occasionally, when the mood was on him, sat in the Kingsguard's common room at night with a cup of wine he barely touched and a book he read only half of, and gave the impression of a man who had made his peace with his situation and was lying about how complete that peace was. Elia had found the thing she had not expected to find, which was a purpose that was entirely her own. She had become, over 15 years of calculated presence, the political center of the court that everyone moved around without fully understanding why. She was not the hand, and was not the small council, and held no formal title except queen, and she was the most important person in the Red Keep after Rhaegar, because she had spent 15 years being the person who understood what was actually happening in any room she entered, while everyone else understood only what was being said. Lyanna was in the north. Prince Aemon Targaryen was 15 years old and constitutionally uncomfortable with being looked at. This was a problem because he was the kind of person who got looked at. The silver hair was his father's, pale almost white, worn to his shoulders, which in the north where he spent his summers marked him as different, and in King's Landing marked him as Targaryen. And in both places caused people to look, and then to look away, and then to look again. The eyes were wrong for the hair. Gray, stark gray, his mother's gray, and the combination unsettled people in a way he had stopped trying to prevent. Aemon Targaryen looked like 2 things at once, which was precisely what he was, and the realm had not yet decided how to categorize it. He was not uncomfortable in the yard. There he was the opposite of uncomfortable. Barristan had been training him since he was old enough to hold a practice sword, and Barristan's training was not the training of a man teaching a boy to perform combat, but of a man teaching a boy to understand it from the inside. Aemon fought the way water moved, which was something Barristan said he had only seen in one other person in his lifetime, and did not specify further, and Aemon had learned not to ask. He spent his summers in Winterfell with his mother and Ned Stark's children, and acquired, over years of northern summers, a quality that was distinct from his court education: a flatness, a literalness, a tendency to say the precise true thing rather than the diplomatically useful adjacent thing. Ned's children had this. It was, Rhaegar had concluded, structural, something in the northern air. He and Crown Prince Aegon had the relationship of brothers who had been required to have it and had discovered, to the general relief of everyone managing the political implications, that they actually did. Aegon was 17, Elia's son, dark-eyed and silver-haired and already better with a sword than most men twice his age, and the relationship between him and Aemon was the specific relationship of two people who understood each other's position without requiring it to be explained. Both of them had been told, at appropriate ages and with varying degrees of completeness, what the prophecy said. Both of them were still deciding what to do with that information. Aegon had decided provisionally that the most useful response was to be good at everything. Aemon had decided, also provisionally, that the most useful response was to be honest about what he didn't know. The raven arrived from Castle Black on the first day of the 9th month of the 15th year. Maester Aemon's handwriting had changed. It had been fine and controlled when Rhaegar's ravens to the wall had been answered years ago, the handwriting of a man who had been scholar enough to maintain precision into extreme old age. This was the same hand, but the letters were larger and less even, the hand of someone writing with urgency that was overriding the care he would normally take. 3 Night's Watch seals. The urgent code. The dead are walking. Lord Commander Mormont sends his request. Come and see. Rhaegar read it twice. Then he sent a raven to Winterfell. Ned arrived 17 days later, which was fast for the road south in the beginning of autumn, which meant he had left quickly after receiving the raven and had not spent much time deciding whether to leave. He was 35 years old and looked like a man who had spent 15 years being responsible for the northern third of a continent, which was exactly what he had done. His dark hair had threads of gray at the temples. The face was the same face, the Stark face, the careful face, the face of someone who had decided at some early point that the truth was the only position worth defending because it was the only one you didn't have to remember having taken. He walked into Rhaegar's solar and looked at the raven on the desk and sat down without being asked, which after 15 years was not remarkable. "How long has he known?" Ned said. "The ranging reports go back 2 years. Unusual wildling movements. Whiting's near Hardhome. His letters to me have been escalating in specificity for 18 months. And you waited for this letter." I was building toward this conversation. There is a difference between understanding something yourself and having the evidence to show a room full of lords. Ned looked at the letter. At the 3 seals. At the handwriting that had lost its precision to urgency. "My bannermen have been sending me things for 2 years also. Hunters who don't come back. Wildlings crossing in numbers that don't match seasonal patterns. Men on the wall who've stopped dismissing the stories. Then you already knew. I knew the thing that I couldn't prove in a room full of southern lords." He looked up. "You're calling a council. I'm calling a council. They won't believe it. Some of them won't. Some of them will believe it and won't care. Because the wall is 1,000 miles from their keeps, and the distance makes caring optional. And some of them," Rhaegar said, "will believe it and understand it, and be the ones I build the actual response around. How much time? I don't know. Long enough to prepare if we begin immediately, not long enough for anything else." Ned was quiet for a moment with the quality of a man doing a specific kind of arithmetic. "Robb is 15. Aemon is 15. I have been training them both as if there was a reason to train them as if there was a reason. There is a reason." "Yes." The word landed flat and final. "There is." The council met in the throne room, which Rhaegar had avoided for the first great council and used now deliberately. The 7 great houses represented, the small council present. The Night's Watch represented by a ranger named Thorne, who had ridden south at Mormont's order and who had the expression of a man who expected to be ignored, and had decided to be angry about it preemptively. Rhaegar presented the evidence without theater. Night's Watch testimony. The wildling intelligence from Ned's northern bannermen. Maester Aemon's collected records, going back 30 years of the other's documented appearances, rare, dismissed, accumulated into a pattern only visible when you looked at 30 years of them together. His own 15 years of preparation, the mathematical shape of what had been built and what remained to build. The resistance arrived on schedule. Mace Tyrell's heir Willis said the wall had stood for 8,000 years and had been sufficient for 8,000 years, and the Night's Watch expansion could be addressed through normal budget processes. A lord from the Reach said the wildling movements could be explained by a bad hunting season. Kevin Lannister said nothing, which was more useful than both of them, because Kevin's silence was the silence of a man reserving judgment rather than dismissing the subject. Ned said, from his position at the table, "I have lost 4 men on ranging patrols beyond my northern borders in the last 18 months. They did not encounter wildlings. No bodies were recovered. In 30 years of managing the northern marches, I have never lost men to an encounter that left no evidence. I am telling you what the evidence looks like when something other than men is doing the killing." The room absorbed this differently from the way it absorbed a Reach Lord's agricultural metaphors. Ned Stark saying something was specific. Ned Stark saying something without visible emotion made it more specific, not less. Doran Martell, who had not spoken, said quietly from his chair, "What do you need?" That was when the room changed. Aemon stood at the back of the throne room. He had not been asked to stand there. He had asked to attend and been given permission, and had found the position at the back wall where he could see the whole room without being at the center of it. He was 15 years old and silver-haired and gray-eyed, and he stood very still in the way of someone who had been taught by multiple people who moved well how stillness was itself a posture. The lords noticed him in the way that people noticed things they were not sure they were supposed to notice. A look, and then away, and then back. The stark gray eyes in the Targaryen face, the boy who was both things, standing against the wall of a throne room while his father described what was coming. Rhaegar did not look at him during the presentation, but when the council session was finished, when the lords were dispersing into the hallways, when the afternoon was beginning to fail through the throne room windows, Rhaegar looked at the back wall. Aemon was still there. They looked at each other across the length of the throne room. Father and son, ice and fire, standing 40 yards apart in a room built for exactly one of them, and belonging, in different ways, to both. Rhaegar did not smile. Aemon did not either. They were Targaryens and they were Starks, and neither of those things produced men who performed emotion for audiences. But something passed between them anyway, the way it had been passing between them for 15 years, across the distance, in the silence. In the specific kind of recognition that exists between people who know what they are to each other without requiring it to be said. The work was not finished. The work was only now becoming visible. Among the Stark children watching from the gallery above, Robb beside Aemon, Sansa 12 and careful, Arya 9 and furious about having been made to sit still. Bran 8, and already looking at the high windows and calculating whether the stonework would hold his weight, none of them knew what was coming. They would learn. That was what was coming next. Castle Black had never seen an army like this, the Night's Watch Rangers who had grown up on the wall's south face, who had learned to read the significance of things by what they brought with them, stood on the battlements in the early morning cold and looked at the columns stretching south down the King's Road until it disappeared over the horizon, and did not speak to each other for a long time. 7 kingdoms. That was what they were looking at. 7 kingdoms that had been 4 months ago arguing in a throne room about budget allocations and the reasonable interpretation of 8,000-year-old stories, and were now here, in the cold, with their banners up and their supply lines extended, and their lords and their levies all pointed at the same thing. The Army of the Dawn. Someone had named it that in King's Landing, and the name had spread the way names spread when they were accurate. Rhaegar rode at the head of the column on a gray horse that was not the horse he had ridden at the Trident. That horse was 15 years dead, but that moved with the same patience of an animal that understood it was carrying something significant and had adjusted its behavior accordingly. He was 39 years old. The silver-gold hair had threads of gray in it that were visible in the northern light, which stripped everything of the flattery that southern light provided. He rode with his back straight and his collarbone, long since healed, no longer held at the careful wrong angle that Ned Stark had noticed on the road from the Ruby Ford. Ned rode to his left. Aemon rode to his right, which was where he had positioned himself at the beginning of the march 3 weeks ago, and where he had remained, and no one had told him to move, because no one had a sufficient argument for where else he should be. Jorah Mormont met them at the gates. He was 58 years old, gray-bearded, with the hands of a man who had spent 30 years doing the actual physical work of the wall rather than administering it from a comfortable room. He had received more royal gold in the last 15 years than the entire Night's Watch had received in the century preceding, and he had spent it on stone and steel, and food, and men, rather than on ceremony. And what he had built showed in the condition of the gates, the staffing of the towers, the watchfulness of the rangers visible on the parapets. He greeted Rhaegar with the formal words, "Ode a king," and then stepped aside from them immediately. "The Maester is asking for you," he said. "Before anything else, he's been asking since we sent the Raven." The Maester's tower was warm. Someone had kept it warm, constantly, aggressively warm, in the way of a space that housed someone for whom cold was no longer inconvenience but genuine threat. Maester Aemon was 102 years old, which was a number that had moved, over the years, from remarkable to something beyond remarkable into a category that did not have a good name. He was blind, had been blind for years. He sat in a chair near the fire wrapped in enough layers that his actual physical dimensions were entirely theoretical, and he held out his hands when he heard the door, and Rhaegar crossed the room and took them. Papery, warm from the fire. Fingers that had written 10,000 letters in a hand that had once been precise and was now large and uneven and urgent. "You came," the old man said. "You asked. I was not certain the asking would be sufficient. I have been uncertain about many things this year that I was previously certain of." He was quiet for a moment. The fire. The wool wrapped around him. "I want to tell you something I have told no one, something I have been holding for a very long time, because the holding of it was necessary, and the time for the holding is finished." Rhaegar waited. "I held the throne once," Maester Aemon said. "Or I could have. I was offered it, many years ago, and I refused it, and I came here instead, and I have spent the decades since understanding the shape of that choice. I refused because I believed the throne would have made me less than I was. I believed service without power was the more honest position." He paused. "I was right. I was also wrong. Because there are moments when the throne is the only thing with enough weight to move what needs moving. You understood that, and you picked it up, and the picking up of it cost you things I watched you pay from 1,000 miles away. Aemon, I am telling you," the old man said, with a sharpness that crossed the century between them without diminishment, "that what you built is sufficient. That I have watched from here, from this tower, from this cold, and I am telling you as the last person alive who knew Aegon the Conqueror's children, who knew what the Targaryens were before the thrones and the dragons and the burning. I am telling you that you are what was needed. Not perfect. Needed. The fire. Now go," Maester Aemon said. "Go and finish it." Rhaegar held the old hands for another moment. Then he stood, and left, and did not look back, because looking back would not have helped either of them. They went beyond the wall at dawn. A ranging of 200, rangers of the Night's Watch who knew the ground, Northern Lords' cavalry who knew cold, Aemon at Rhaegar's side where he had been for 3 weeks, and where Ned had spent 3 weeks attempting to argue him away from, and had stopped attempting. The wall behind them was 700 feet of ancient ice, blue-green in the early light, solid past the point of comprehension. Built by people who had understood something that the realm had spent 8,000 years forgetting. The haunted forest received them the way it received everything. Without acknowledgement. Without adjustment. Trees that had been growing since before the wall was built, black bark, branches without leaves in the early autumn cold, the ground beneath them soft and wrong. Sound moved differently in it. Distances were unreliable. The rangers moved with the specific economy of people who had learned to trust their instincts about direction because their instincts were more reliable than their eyes. They found the first one a mile in. It had been a man. It was not anymore. It was standing between two black trees with its head turned at the angle that heads did not turn, looking at the ranging with eyes that were the specific blue-white of something that had been cold for a very long time. Around it, 3 more. Then, at the edge of sight, movement, not the movement of animals or men. The movement of things that had forgotten what movement was for and were doing it anyway. The fight was fast and wrong. Arrows did nothing. Swords did nothing. Men who understood combat found themselves managing an enemy that did not respond to the premises of combat, that did not feel the strikes, did not react to wounds, did not slow when its legs were compromised. The Rangers with Dragonglass moved to the front because they had been told about Dragonglass and had their instructions, and those instructions were correct. What Dragonglass touched came apart. Not like flesh coming apart, like ice coming apart. A shattering, fast, final, the thing inside it released and gone. Aemon fought with the specific quality of someone for whom combat had been so thoroughly internalized that he had processing space left over for observation. He moved, and the spear moved with him. Dragonglass tip, ash shaft, Barristan's footwork and Ned Stark's economy of motion combined into something that was not either of them, and was entirely his. He did not speak during it. He did not look afraid. He looked like a person doing a thing he had always known he would eventually do. The whites fell. The ranging held. 20 minutes of wrong, cold fighting, and then quiet. The specific quiet of a forest that has registered something and is withholding comment. At the tree line, 50 yards north, 2 figures stood. Not whites. Not the disorganized shambling of the dead. These stood with the posture of things that had intelligence, that had purpose, that had will, that were deciding something. Their armor was ice. Their eyes were the same blue-white as the whites, but older, deeper. The blue of something that had been cold since before the wall was built. They held weapons that were not metal. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They watched. Rhaegar looked at them and understood, finally, the shape of the thing he had been preparing for 23 years. It was not an army. It was not a force. It was a patience, an 8,000-year patience, a thing that had waited through the building of the wall and the forgetting of the wall, and the slow, comfortable decline of the realm's memory of what was beyond it, and was now awake again, and was looking at what the realm had assembled, and making its own calculations. He held its gaze for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and the ranging withdrew, south back toward the wall, carrying its wounded and its certainty. They climbed the wall at dusk. The lift mechanism was large enough for 10 men, and slow enough that the climb gave you time to watch the world reorganize itself below you. The camp, the banners, the fires being lit as the light failed, the ordered shape of an army that had been built out of 15 years of quiet preparation and 4 months of active assembly. The 7 kingdoms, from 700 feet, looked like one thing. At the top, the wind was constant and had been constant since the wall was built, and would be constant when the wall was gone. It came from the north, from whatever was north of north, and it was the cold of something other than weather. Below them to the north, the haunted forest was dark. The white walkers were not visible. They were present. The difference between those two things was the wall itself. Rhaegar looked north for a long time. Aemon stood beside him. The boy who was 15 and silver-haired and gray-eyed and constitutionally uncomfortable with being looked at, stood on top of the wall in the wind and looked at the dark below them with the expression of someone who had arrived, after a long journey, at the place that had always been the destination. Rhaegar said, "I used to play you a song when you were small. Do you remember?" "The dragon song," Aemon said. "With the ice in the last verse. I wrote it for you. I wrote it for Aegon. I wrote it for Rhaenys." He looked at the dark below them. "I called it a song of ice and fire. It is what all 3 of you are. It is what I believed the realm needed, and could not produce without the choices I made." Aemon was quiet for a moment. Was it worth it? Not accusation. The genuine question of a 15-year-old who had been told his entire life that his existence was the product of a prophecy, and had reached the age where he could ask what that meant to the man who had believed it. Rhaegar did not answer immediately. He thought about Robert in the river, about Aerys on the steps of the throne, about the tent on the bank and the tower in the marches and the dragon pit, and 15 years of governing a kingdom that had not wanted to be governed by him until it had no better option. About Elia's face, when she understood. About Lyanna's face when she understood that understanding did not change the cost. "Ask me that after," he said. "I'll have a better answer." Aemon looked at him with the gray Stark eyes. Then, with the particular literalness of someone who had grown up spending summers in the north and winters in the Red Keep, and had acquired the bluntness of the former, "You won't be here after." Rhaegar looked at his son. "No. You know that. I have known it for a long time. Prophecies are specific about some things and vague about others, and one of the things mine was specific about is that the three heads ride. Not the father, the children. My part is the building." "That is not," Aemon stopped. Restarted, "You built it." "I built it." "Then it was worth it," Aemon said. "Whatever the answer is, it was worth it. The thing you built is here. I am here. Aegon and Rhaenys will be here. The army below us is here. You did not do it alone, and you could not have done it alone, and all of it together, all of the choices and the costs and the things that cannot be repaired, all of it is what brought us to this wall on this night, with what we have behind us. So the answer is yes. Whatever you need it to cost, the answer is yes." He said it the way Ned Stark said things, flatly, without performance, with the specific certainty of someone who had decided what was true and saw no reason to decorate it. The boy had his father's silver hair, and his mother's eyes and his uncle's manner of arriving at a position and holding it without apology. Rhaegar looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked north, at the dark where the dead were gathering, at the patience of something that had been waiting since before the wall was built and was now watching the wall with what it used instead of interest. Behind them, the banners of 7 kingdoms moved in the wind at the base of the ice. Below them, fires. Below the fires, men who had come from every corner of the realm because their king had spent 15 years building a structure capable of asking them to come. And they had come. He had won at the Trident. He had secured the city. He had held the council. He had made the compromises and kept the promises and built the thing that needed building. And it had cost what it had cost, and the cost was not in question. The real war had never been at the Trident. The real war was here. On top of 8,000 years of ice and faith, with his son beside him, and the realm behind him, and the dark ahead, and the song he had been writing his entire life was finally loud enough for the people who needed to hear it to hear it. He was ready. They were ready. He turned from the north and walked back toward the lift, and his son walked beside him, and below them the army of the dawn kept its fires burning against the dark. The fires held. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.